Hello and welcome to Future Review. Today I'll be sharing with you part 1 of The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. As usual with book reviews, spoiler alert, if this is a problem, please leave the video now. You have been warned. And with that, let's get into the book. The Invisible Man starts with a strange man staggering into an English hotel. The strange man is completely covered, head to toe, in various clothes and bandages, leaving no skin exposed. He declines to have his coat taken by the hotel staff and just gets a room. He also brings in a lot of strange luggage, including scientific books, glass bottles, and enough chemicals to make one suspicious. The strange man is highly irritable and aloof, and he greatly values his privacy. He mostly keeps to himself in his room. And soon enough, rumors abound as to exactly who this strange man is. Some of the locals think that he's an eccentric scientist, some think he's a fugitive running from the law, and some think he's simply crazy. Judging from the noises coming from his room, though, he seems to be conducting experiments in his room, which actually are causing a great deal of damage to the hotel, which keeps being added to his bill on his insistence. Eventually, one of the other guests confronts the strange man as to exactly who he is, but he doesn't tell him much. And soon afterwards, the vicar of the village is robbed, but no one knows by whom. And at the same time, the owner of the hotel is getting sick of the strange man's shenanigans and damages to the hotel, and so he confronts him, tells him to pay all of his bills, including the damages, and leave. In a fit of rage, the strange man reveals his secret to the owner. He takes off some of his clothes and reveals that there is nothing, or seemingly nothing, where flesh should be. He's completely invisible under all of his clothes. At the same time as this, though, the evidence is actually towards the evidence of the vicar's robbery actually leads to this invisible man, and a policeman is shown up to arrest the strange man. But the invisible man resists, and using his invisibility, he escapes the crowd that is gathered around to try and arrest him, and he flees town altogether. Soon after this, a wandering drunk named Thomas Marvel hears a voice seemingly coming from nowhere. It is the Invisible Man, and he explains his situation to Marvel. He also recruits Marvel to be his visible agent in the world because there are certain things that an Invisible Man can't do if people can't actually see him, and he needs some kind of agent to do his will in the world. And he promises Marvel that an Invisible Man is a man of great power and that he can do a lot of great things for him, but that Marvel is also defenseless against the Invisible Man, so don't betray me. And the first thing that the Invisible Man does with Marvel is to recover his scientific books that he was doing his experiments with from the hotel, because he didn't take that when he fled, obviously. And so Marvel goes to the town with the Invisible Man following closely behind him, and he recovers his books. But Marvel realizes at this point that in this state he is basically the slave of the Invisible Man, and he doesn't want to live like this for the rest of his life, and so he tries to escape the Invisible Man's service. But he's caught quickly, and the Invisible Man threatens him, saying that if you ever try this again, I will kill you right there and then. This does not stop Marvel from trying to escape for a second time soon afterwards, and this time he's more successful, fleeing to a different town, screaming that the Invisible Man is coming. The story of the Invisible Man by this point is spread to many English towns, although some people think it's just a hoax. Enough townspeople gather around to defend him to make this somewhat difficult for the Invisible Man, and a confrontation happens in the town bar. During this confrontation, one of the other bar patrons actually manages to shoot the Invisible Man, grazing him, which it's not a serious injury, but it causes him to flee altogether, plotting his next move. Soon after this, one Dr. Kemp hears a voice coming from nowhere. It is once again the Invisible Man. At first, Kemp actually doesn't believe it because he thinks, I don't believe in voices, I'm not superstitious. But the Invisible Man eventually touches him to prove that he is in fact a real man, like made of real flesh, but just invisible, which causes him to panic, and he has to calm him down. After Dr. Kemp calms down, the Invisible Man explains his circumstances in more detail. He gives his real name, which is Griffin, and he explains that in actuality, Griffin and Dr. Kemp are colleagues. They were both former medical students in the same class at University College, Oxford. Before Griffin tells Dr. Kemp more, he wants to get some food, and he also asks to sleep in Dr. Kemp's house for the night, since he's hungry and tired. Dr. Kemp agrees to this, mostly out of fear, but while Griffin is sleeping, Dr. Kemp contacts the authorities, and so the countdown for their arrival has begun. In the morning, Griffin explains his situation more fully to Dr. Kemp. Griffin eventually abandoned medicine to pursue his real passion in science, which was optics. And while he was pursuing optics, Griffin had this idea of how to turn objects invisible. You see, Griffin's idea was that the way we see things is based on how objects interact with light. Objects either reflect, refract, or absorb light, and this interaction with light and the surroundings and the contrast is how we see things. Griffin reasons if he could find a way to make an object's refractive index, meaning the way an object refracts or in general interacts with light, the same as the surrounding air, that object would become effectively transparent and thus invisible. And so, with this idea in mind, Griffin set to work on figuring out a way to make this a reality. He worked on this idea for years, becoming increasingly obsessive about becoming invisible. He became so obsessive that he actually robbed his father for funds. You can see he's becoming more and more unhinged as this invisibility thing progresses. Eventually, years after his initial idea, Griffin does eventually come up with the chemicals needed to turn the various tissues of biological organisms into transparent and thus invisible. He first tests this on a cat in his apartment, and it works. And so Griffin decides to test these chemicals on himself next. He swallows the chemicals and waits for them to take effect. However, there was a problem because the landlord at this time came by soon after he swallowed the chemicals himself, based on reports he'd been hearing from his neighbors about the cat screaming because those chemicals apparently caused the cat to suffer a lot. And the neighbors, based on the noises coming from his apartment, the neighbors thought Griffin was like vivisecting a cat or something like that, or torturing it in some way, which was highly illegal. And so the landlords come around to check what exactly is going on. However, when Griffin opens the door, the landlord almost immediately screams and flees, and Griffin soon sees afterwards in the mirror that it's because he's turning corpse white, and he looks quite horrifying at this point. The chemicals take time to take effect, and they haven't fully made him invisible yet, although he looks quite terrifying at this point. And over the night that follows, Griffin suffers greatly, as the chemicals take full effect. But by the morning, the Griffin is fully invisible. And by this point, the landlord has come back with an entourage to really sort out this situation, because there's some strange things happening in his apartment. But Griffin has accomplished his goal at this point, so he burns down the apartment, and he incites arson on his own building to cover up what he's been doing, and also to provide a cover for his escape now that he's invisible. Now that Griffin is invisible, he thinks of all the interesting things that he can do, well, now that he's invisible, Ring of Gyges style. But he soon discovers that being invisible has some serious disadvantages. One, his clothes aren't invisible, and so if he has to go completely naked, if he actually wants to get the benefits of his invisibility, which is a problem because it's starting to get cold, it's that colder time of the year. And there's also the fact that when Griffin eats food, while it's undigested, the food is not transparent, but the rest of his body is, so the food, you can see it in his stomach, which reveals where he is. There's also the problems that he still there's snow on the ground at this point, so he still has footprints, which is weird to people who notice this. And also dogs can still smell him and thus track him like normal. And so Griffin realizes that at this time of year, he can't really survive out in the open, so he needs something else. He takes refuge in a department store, where he finds, luckily, clothing and food, and a place to rest. However, a few days in, he gets caught in his clothes, and so he has to ditch the clothes and escape. And so now at this point, he's back to being cold and hungry on the run. And while he's on the run, he robs some homes that he encounters for food and money. And eventually, he scrounges up some clothes. He collects what remains of his books and scientific materials, and he eventually heads to a hotel. And we're back at the beginning of the story, and you've heard the rest. And so now Dr. Kemp has been updated on exactly what Griffin has been doing this whole time. And Griffin tells Kemp that at this point, uh, he was actually trying to undo the experiment. That's what he was doing in the hotel, because he's realized that invisible life is not particularly good, and he wants to go back to his normal life. But unfortunately, he can't do that at this point because Thomas Marvel, who escaped from him, still has his scientific books that he needs to recreate the experiment. And he can't actually get to Thomas Marvel because he's in the strongest protective custody possible. So originally, Griffin's plan was to just take a ship to a different city they had never heard of the Invisible Man and basically start over. But now that he's gone to Dr. Kemp, Griffin has a different plan, which he explains to Dr. Kemp. Griffin reasons that the main two things that invisibility actually allows him to do very well are approach people unseen and escape people unseen. This means that the Invisible Man is effectively a perfect assassin. He can strike people unexpectedly and then escape with impunity. This combined with the fact that he's invisible, meaning that he could theoretically be anywhere at any time because no one knows exactly where he is. He can't strictly be tracked. Means that the Invisible Man could theoretically, say, issue orders, no underdoor style, and then kill anyone who disobeys or aids those who disobey with impunity. In other words, the Invisible Man could theoretically establish a reign of terror over the whole country and rule over it in his own name. And that's exactly what the Invisible Man proposes to Kemp. He also proposes that Kemp be his visible agent, like what Thomas Marvel was, his compatriot in the Reign of Terror. And by this point, the authorities have actually arrived and are lying in wait. And once they hear this, they pounce to try and arrest Griffin before he can actually put his plan into action. But, of course, Griffin is invisible, and he uses this to escape once again. Soon afterwards, Griffin sends a note to the surrounding villages saying that Dr. Kemp will be the first to die in his reign of terror for being the first person to disobey him. Dr. Kemp, being a rational person, realizes that Griffin needs to be stopped right here and now before he kills anyone else. And so he sets himself up as bait in his house with the police lying in wait once again. Griffin eventually arrives, of course, and the struggle begins. Griffin, of course, initially has the advantage due to being completely stealthed, and he, at first, scores a major win by shooting the chief of police who is outside of Kemp's house. And then he breaks into the house, and then the real struggle for Kemp begins. The authorities know that he's invisible by this point, so they try and track him using, his noises, footsteps, and various door turn knobs and that sort of stuff. But Kemp actually flees the house in a panic, and he flees to the rest of the town with Griffin chasing him. Griffin eventually catches up to Kemp and starts to strangle him, but by this point, the rest of the town has come to Kemp's defense. And now that Griffin is strangling Kemp, meaning he is pinned down in one place, the townspeople know where he is. And so they surround him, and they manage to grab Griffin. And by this point, he can't escape this, because the mob has already grabbed him. The mob starts to beat Griffin severely. Kemp tries to stop them before it's too late, but the mob is out for blood at this point, and they kill Griffin. Griffin's body becomes visible after death, revealing a sad, pathetic man full of rage. And he's taken away now that the townspeople are ready to put this whole episode behind them. After this, Thomas Marvel has actually kept the money that Griffin stole in his robberies and has used it to open up the Invisible Man Inn, which he now runs as the successful owner of. Secretly, though, Thomas Marvel has also kept what remains of Griffin's notes, scientific notes, to try and recreate the experiment and become invisible himself. However, some of the notes have been washed out, and the remainder are in Greek and Latin, which, for a man of Thomas Marvel's education, he cannot possibly hope to understand. And that concludes The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. If you enjoyed that, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until the next video, goodbye for now.